This is where we left off yesterday. Having trouble getting everything on the screen here. So we left off yesterday talking about the Babylonian captivity. Moving on. Alright, this leads to the Great Schism. Now remember, the reason this is significant is it's all happening in the 100 years or 200 years before the Protestant Reformation. So this is all leading into that. In this, it shows you here there were two popes. Again, I believe there were three, and at one point, even four. That's never going to be on the exam. And there you see it. Remember, you're writing all this down. It's underlined. This further damaged the prestige of the church. I'll go back here. Damaged the prestige of the church. This kind of shows here a map. And you see this division going on. And what you see is the two different colors there, who they were, had their allegiance to. And the, I guess, violet colors had their allegiance to Avignon. And then the green colors had their allegiance to Rome, which is interesting. This part of Italy down here, it has allegiance to the Pope in Avignon. And this may not have anything to do with religion. I've never been to Italy, but I will tell you, one year I had a Sicilian girl in class, and this was hysterical, having her in class. And she told me that the Southern Italians and the Northern Italians did not like each other. I have no idea if this is true. And she basically said the Northern Italians said the Southern Italians were dumb, and I said, no, that sounds like the United States. So again, I don't know if you're Italian. I've had many Italian students. None of them have chosen to argue with me on this topic. I think it's interesting to see here, Northern Italy supports one pope, and Southern Italy does the other. All right, well, I clicked by accident and went on the next. All right, that's the same slide. We're going backwards. Okay, this leads to the so-called Consular Movement. But anyway, so go ahead and write this down. There's a Consular Movement, and this is the idea that the church should be led by a council. I'm going to guess they wanted 12 members. Who knows? But they wanted a council of cardinals that would overrule the Pope. It doesn't pass, but they do get a new Pope, Pope Martin V. You don't need to memorize that name or number. Unlike AP World, where you did not need to know numbers when you talked about a king, you do need to know names and numbers in AP European. I will try, there's a huge difference between Louis XIV and Louis XVI. AP World, think about it, was, playtime compared to some of the stuff we're going to learn in here. You're going to need to know the actual names and numbers, but I'll tell you which ones are important. All right, that's the Consular Movement. Fall of the Byzantine Empire, I don't know why that's here. You're supposed to know all about that, 1453. That's all AP World. I don't even know if it's going to show up this year, so other than writing the title down, I don't want you to write any of the notes down here. I do want you to write this, the year, just because the year is so important. We are going to be talking about Turkey and Constantinople and Istanbul and all that when we get to World War I. I wrote my master's thesis on submarines in the Dardanelles, which is near Istanbul. So this is going to show up in World War I. Just trust me on that. Just put it in your notes and let's move on. Okay. Well, there you go. Constantinople was renamed Istanbul. Give you the whole history of the city. The city was called Byzantium. Constantine went over there and wanted to make a Roman capital there. Named it after himself because he's so humble. Constantinople. And then later on, when the Muslims came in and took it away from the Christians, they renamed it Istanbul, which it is still named today. Moving on. I do want you to write this because when we get to the Renaissance, it is going to be important when we get to the defeat of the Spanish Armada that you understand when the Europeans start fighting. I'm talking while you're writing here. It's going to be important for you to understand that while the European Christians are killing each other, they have a dual threat behind them, which is the Ottoman Muslim Empire. And that's going to show up when we talk about the very powerful king of Spain, where he's trying to defeat England, but he's got to keep an eye, I'm doing this thing with my head. He's got to keep an eye behind him on the Ottoman Muslims. So don't forget that they're out there. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about them. We will talk about Suleiman the Magnificent, some, and the Ottomans, some, but moving on here. Okay, now, very important here that you understand this. I'm watching the clock here. And I normally do this lecture the Thursday or Friday of the first week of school. That's where we are. This lecture you should be watching Thursday. And we talk about these three famous authors, and I usually do give you some kind of cooperative learning. I don't know how we're going to do that this year. I know that you can do breakout rooms, but I like to put kids in groups of 3 or 4. I don't know how I'll do that this year. I'd kind of like to have you exchange cell phone numbers, but I think that's probably going to be a problem. I'll try to figure something out. I don't want you working by yourself. Anyway, here's the key thing you got to get out of this. Later Middle Ages, you have this rise of this so-called nationalist literature. Okay? And there's the key word you got to know, vernacular. And it means a natural language. To me, it means kind of like, I won't say slang, but it's people's everyday language. And so every now and then, I get really annoyed. Hopefully no other teachers will watch this. And all this education doublespeak. These people use formative, summative, this, that, and the other. To me, I've been teaching so long, they come in with these new theories and they go out the window. Marzano, this, thinking maps, this, that, and the other. And I just want to say, one year I got so annoyed because they started saying you had to put your categories formative and summative for your grades. I just actually called my grades. I had 2 types of grades. I actually titled it 70% grades and 30% grades. I never got in trouble for that, but sometimes I just want them to use everyday words and not speak education speak. But anyway, that's just the way education has always been. I try to stay away from all that if I can. But anyway, vernacular is, in my definition, is everyday language. So there's going to be 3 books that are written that are hugely important. The first one is the Divine Comedy, Dante Alighieri. And if we were in class, I'd ask you what's his most famous book. And the Divine Comedy was about a tour of, to be honest, it's been so long. I know it's a tour of heaven and hell, but the most famous part is the tour of hell, and it's called Dante's Inferno. That's what it's nicknamed. And I read it in college, and I used to know a lot about it. And if you just mentioned it to your English teacher, they could probably talk for a whole week on it. But what's interesting, this guy is asleep in the story, as I recall. It's like 30 years ago when I read it, maybe even 40, that he has this dream, and he goes on a tour of hell. In hell, there's levels of hell. Okay? You with me on this? I think probably a lot of you have already heard of this. Maybe everybody. He goes through these levels of hell, and on each, as he goes down, the further he goes down, the worse the sins are that they're there for. And so if you died and were sentenced to hell, I'm making it sound like a courtroom, you went to judgment day before God, and you were sent to hell for this sin, and it wasn't that bad a sin, you had a lighter punishment than someone who did something really bad. Now, let me tell you why this is important. This is, who knows what this guy Dante even believed. As far as I know, he just wrote a book. Maybe he considered it fiction. I don't really think he had went to hell, but who knows? I wasn't there. But the deal is, when you read this, here's what's interesting. He wrote it in the everyday language, the vernacular, but here's what he's saying. He's saying, in the time that I was alive, and you can look at the years, this is what we think was bad. And what's interesting, if you were to go back 400 or 500 years ago to Apopka, I'm sure there were just Native Americans here, and if you could talk to them and find out what is the worst thing anybody can do, what they listed would probably be something very different than you would list. And so what we find is, the centuries go by, there are things that people consider wrong that change. So societal standards change, and so used to be in the past, I would give 2 different group work assignments. One, which is the one I'm going to try and give you, which is based on Dante's Inferno. I don't know yet how we're going to do that. But the other one I used to give, I haven't given many years, is I would divide the kids up into groups, And instead of talking about major sins which would have God send you to hell, they were like social sins. Because we talked about community values and what they call mores. And social sins were like public drunkenness. They were trying to humiliate people. And what was interesting is one year I put the kids into groups and I said, you got to come up with the 5 worst social sins. Now we're not talking about murder, rape, child abuse. Well, I'll tell you how silly it is. This is what you guys get triggered by. That's the word, triggered by. And one year it was hysterical. This one group came up with the worst, absolute worst thing you could do socially at Apopka High School was not steal somebody's girlfriend, was not talk bad about somebody on social media. The worst thing you could do was break in the lunch line. And I mean, this one group got up. We used to present back in those days, and we may do that if we ever, get back in the. I should say when we get back in the classroom this year. And it was funny. This one group presented that, and the class cheered. Cheered this group's decision that the worst social sin you could do would be to break in the lunch line. Anyway, that's not what we're talking about here. This was him going down through these circles of hell. I used to tell the swim team, I would say, okay, guys, next we have this thing called Hell Week. This will be the first year, I guess, since I've been a coach that we're not going to have Hell Week because we're starting the season so late. Sorry, as I am preparing this lecture for tomorrow, my 7th period European history class is on this other computer over here. They're in a big blue button group. Somebody's asking me questions, so I got to go back and forth. Interesting, I'm preparing tomorrow's lecture today while my current 7th period European history class on Thursday is doing the one I recorded last night. I'm trying to get a little bit ahead here. I'm not known for organization, but I'm trying to be. Anyway, back to this topic. So, and I would tell my swim team, I said, next week can be bad. We're going down to the 7th circle of hell. That's a reference to Dante's Divine Comedy, Dante's Inferno. Here's why this is important. And I need to get this point out. I've wasted too much time on this. When Dante wrote this, he's telling us what are the worst things, worst sins for that time period. Understand? This what was the worst thing to do. And what's interesting is as he gets to the bottom level of hell, he finally gets to the bottom level of hell, and it's supposed to be cold, right? I'm sorry, it's supposed to be hot, right? It's not, it's cold. And when he gets to the bottom, whoever this person is, I don't think it's Dante himself, he's got a protagonist. Whoever this is, when they get to the bottom level of hell, the Inferno, it's freezing cold, and Satan is there, Lucifer himself, who's a giant dragon, and he's frozen in the ice. And there are 3 people frozen there with him. As I recall, he was biting on them. I don't remember. Some of you may really be into this this whole concept. There's actually a video game called The Inferno, and I had a student who played it and said it wasn't that good. But there's just a lot of interest in this book, in this concept. Anyway, so here's what I'm saying is those 3 people that are buried in the ice with Lucifer, Dante is saying these are the worst human beings that have ever lived. Who were they? Judas Iscariot, that was one of Jesus' disciples, the one that betrayed him. And the other 2 were Brutus and Cassius. I realize a lot of you don't know who that is. But what's about to happen is the Renaissance. And the Renaissance looked backward to the heyday in European history of the Roman Empire. Who was the most famous leader of the Roman Empire? Julius Caesar. He was stabbed to death on the Senate floor, the Roman Senate floor, by 2 people, Brutus and Cassius. And so when the author of the Divine Comedy puts Brutus and Cassius there in the lowest level of hell, he's saying these are the worst people who ever lived, because basically they ended the greatest thing that ever existed, which was the Roman Empire, which they really didn't do that. But anyway, that's the thing. I tell students all the time that there are probably things, I'm sure there are things going on today which are acceptable in our culture and our society. No, I'm not going to give you a list. Those of you who know me, you should be able to figure it out. There are things going on right now that are legal and acceptable. I'm convinced one day is going to be considered horrific. I mean, look how when Nazi Germany was basically mistreating the Jews, the Germans, many common ordinary Germans, looked the other way. And now we look back and we say, how can you have done that? How could you have ignored what was going on? And we'll learn about the Holocaust. Hitler put every single one of his death camps in Poland. Not a single one of the death camps. We'll get to the difference between a work camp and a death camp. Were located in Germany. But we still look back and we point back through the decades with an accusatory finger saying, how could you have let this happen? And the answer, I guess, for this is, those guys, I guess a lot of them were trying to protect their own skin, the survival instinct, but also society, I don't know if this is a good example for that, but society's standards changed. And so that's why these books are so important. It gives, I hope you're paying this attention to this and writing notes in the margin. This is why these 3 books are so important. They give us a view of contemporary societal standards back then. All right, we'll talk more on Dante's Inferno later on. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. I grew up in a small southern town called Bonifay, Florida. I lived 20 miles outside of town, and so we had a 30-minute bus ride to school every day. And we're out in the middle of the country, but we'd go to this town, and I had this English teacher. And in my high school was small. We didn't have AP classes. We had a class called English Composition you could take your senior year, and that was the one for the smart kids going to college. So similar to AP here, I guess. These are the kids that know they're going to college. And she assigned for us this teacher. She died a few years ago, and she had a big impact on my life. I probably didn't like her when you know how kids are. Hopefully you're not this way, kind of rebellious. But we complained about her, but I look back, she had a big impact on my life. And whenever I have kids in class who are being a butthead towards me, and hopefully none of you ever will be, I have to stop and think, well, dang, I was a troublemaker. I'm not even going to tell you stories how I was in high school. And so maybe this is what you call karma. But the deal is, she made us read the Canterbury Tales. And here's how she introduced it. This is a small, very, very Christian Southern Baptist town. And here's what she said was, she goes, a lot of people tell me I shouldn't assign the Canterbury Tales because it's pornography. But it's really not that bad. Of course, as soon as she said that, I'm just going to say back then, all the boys wanted to read it. And, well, here's the story. And you want to write a little summary in your notes. So there's this famous religious site in England called Canterbury. It's where a famous murder happened. And the person who was murdered was made a saint. And so what these people did back then, if they wanted a miracle or they needed something from God, they would go on a pilgrimage. And they would walk, 100 miles to Canterbury and, hoping to get their miracle. And now this is a fictional book, but here's what happens. These guys go on the road to Canterbury, and it's going to be a long trip, so here's what they do. Every day, I'm just going to make up the number. I can't remember how many there are. I read this in high school, for heaven's sake. Let's say there's 30 of them. I don't know. Every day, a different one has to tell a story. And so they tell a story, and that's the story of the Canterbury Tales. There's all these different stories. Okay? And again, same thing for the last one. When we read this, we learn that what it was like for the common people back then. Okay? And here's what I remember. 2 or 3 stories out of this book. Number 1, I remember there was some scene where some person was climbing through a window, I think on a ladder or something, and somebody was behind him and they farted in their face. And I remember reading this like, why am I reading this? And it dawns on you. What this means is it was a joke in the book. It was supposed to be funny. What does this mean? Hundreds of years ago, people made fart jokes. That's what you get out of this. And the second one, there was some guy in town whose wife was cheating on him, and everybody knew about it except him. And there was a word for that. And I remember just sitting there thinking when I read this, well, I hope to get married one day, and I hope I never become this, where my wife is sleeping with everybody and nobody knows but me. And the word is cuckold, Cuckold. The dictionary may give a different definition. That's how it was explained to us. And so, again, this book was a snapshot into the lives of these people back then. And this one, which I have not read, I just want you to know the name of it. I know we're supposed to cover these 3 books. The other 2 I've read. Well, I tell you what, the Canterbury Tales, you're probably not going to meet a whole lot of people who read them other than serious college students, but you're going to meet a lot of people who are assigned the divine, Dante's Inferno or know something about it. All right, moving on here. He was the greatest poet of medieval France. I know you can't really see that. All right. Okay, so I want to show this video. This may just... Is there a video here? Oh, yes. It's going to try and play. Maybe it won't. Guess not. Oh,